The ink was barely dry on his commission when Benjamin Franklin walked out into the Philadelphia afternoon and looked down a road that disappeared into the trees. It was the summer of 1775, and the air smelled of horse and river mud and something else, something harder to name, the particular smell of a country that does not yet know what it is. He was 69 years old. His knees ached in the mornings. He had already lived 3 or 4 lives by most men's measure: printer, philosopher, diplomat, inventor, and now someone had handed him something stranger than any of it. They had handed him the silence between people, and they had asked him to fill it. The job was called Postmaster General of the United Colonies, and it was, on its surface, a bureaucratic appointment. A matter of routes and rates and the orderly movement of paper from one hand to another. But Franklin understood, the way only certain people understand certain things, quietly and completely, without needing to say it aloud, that a letter is never just a letter. A letter is a voice. A letter is a hand reaching across a darkness that used to be called distance. And what he had been asked to build was not a postal system. He had been asked to build the thing that would teach 13 separate, suspicious, proud and fractious colonies how to feel like one country. He had been asked to build the nervous system of a nation that did not yet have a body. Settle in now. Pull whatever warmth you have a little closer. Because this story begins not with a battle or a declaration, but with something quieter and stranger, and, in its own way, just as brave. He had known distance his whole life. As a boy in Boston, he had watched ships disappear into the Atlantic and wondered what they carried and where they went. As a young man, he had walked the roads of this continent before most of them deserved the name. He knew what it meant to wait for news. He knew the specific hollow feeling of not knowing whether someone you loved was well, whether a debt had been settled, whether the world had shifted while you were standing still. He had spent decades watching people live inside that silence, and he had decided, long before anyone officially asked him, that silence was something that could be engineered away. His office was modest. His tools were ink and reason, and a mind that had never once been intimidated by the size of a problem. He spread his maps across the table, hand-drawn, imprecise, full of gaps where no one had travelled yet or no one had bothered to record, and he began to think. Not quickly. Franklin never thought quickly about things that mattered. He thought the way a river moves around stone, patiently, persistently, finding the line of least resistance without ever losing direction. Outside, a city was beginning to understand that war was coming, but inside that small room, an old man was already thinking past the war to the country that would need to speak to itself when it was over, and the maps waited for him, full of roads that barely existed, leading toward a future that no one could quite see yet. Before a single letter could travel, someone had to walk the road, not ride it, not map it from a comfortable distance, but walk it boot by boot, mile by mile, through the particular misery of early American terrain that cared nothing for human plans. The forests of the eastern seaboard in the 18th century were not the gentle, trail-marked woods of a Sunday afternoon. They were old and indifferent and enormous, the kind of darkness that swallowed sound, that made a man feel less like a traveller and more like a rumour passing through something that had existed long before him and would exist long after. Into these forests Franklin sent his surveyors. He sent them with notebooks and compasses and instructions that were, at their heart, simply this: find out what is actually there. What they found was both magnificent and quietly terrifying. There were roads, yes, but the word road in 1775 required a generosity of imagination that bordered on fiction. Some were little more than widened animal paths, still bearing the gentle curves of deer logic rather than human intention. Others vanished entirely in wet seasons, swallowed by mud so deep it had claimed wagon wheels and animal legs, and the patience of every traveller who had ever trusted them. Between Boston and New York, a journey that a modern mind measures in hours, a letter might travel for 2 weeks, passed from hand to uncertain hand, stored in saddlebags that leaked, tucked into the coat of a rider who might stop for 3 days at an inn because the river was too high and the world simply had to wait. And yet people had been sending letters anyway. This is the thing that moves something deep in the chest, if you let it. Long before there was any system, long before Franklin or Roots or official anything, people had been finding ways to reach each other. They handed letters to travelers heading in the right direction. They paid merchants to carry words alongside their goods. They pressed folded paper into the hands of strangers at crossroads and said, simply, "Please, if you pass through such a place, if you happen to know a man named so-and-so, if you would be so kind." The entire pre-postal communication of a continent ran on the extraordinary fragile currency of human goodwill, and somehow, improbably, some of it arrived. Franklin looked at all of this, the mud, the gaps, the heroic improvisation of it, and did not despair. Despair was never particularly useful, and Franklin was, above all things, useful. He began to draw lines, not the lines that were already there, the inherited roots of colonial habit, but new lines, lines that followed logic, that shortened distances, that connected the places people actually needed to reach rather than the places roads had accidentally ended up. He was redesigning the circulatory system of a body that was still learning. It had a heartbeat. There was a surveyor named Thomas who walked the road between Philadelphia and Annapolis 3 times that autumn, each time in different weather, counting his steps and making small marks in a notebook with a cover worn soft as skin. He did not think of himself as doing anything historic. He thought of himself as cold and tired and reasonably certain the left boot was beginning to fail. The price of a single letter in 1775 was not measured only in money, though the money was real enough and painful enough on its own. It was measured in the particular arithmetic of people who counted every coin twice before spending one. The arithmetic of farmers and weavers and fishermen and the wives of men who had gone somewhere else looking for something better and needed to say so. To send a letter from New York to Virginia in those years cost roughly 80 cents in the currency of the time, which sounds modest until you understand that for a labouring man it represented the better part of a full day's work. A day of planting or hauling or mending traded for the privilege of sending 20 words to someone you loved and were not sure you would see again. Many people simply did not do it. They swallowed the words instead and carried them. And sometimes the carrying was heavier than anything they moved with their hands. The rates were not simple either, because nothing in the early postal system was simple, if it could possibly be complicated. The cost of a letter depended on how many sheets of paper it contained, and how far it needed to travel, and whether the sender paid or the receiver, and often the receiver, opening a letter at the door with mud still on their boots, would look at the fee being asked and make a quiet calculation that was not really about money at all. It was about whether the news inside was worth what was being charged for it outside, and there was no way to know until you had already paid. Take a slow breath here. We are about to go somewhere very ordinary and very far away, and the ordinariness is precisely the point. Her name was Margaret, and she lived outside a town in western Massachusetts that no longer exists under that name, in a house that was more ambition than architecture, gaps in the walls stuffed with rags, a roof that discussed the rain rather than deflecting it. Her husband, James, had gone to Philadelphia 3 months earlier looking for work in the printing trades because a man named Franklin had made printing sound like the future, and James had always been susceptible to the idea of the future. He had promised to write. He had written twice. The letters had cost him what he could not easily spare, and they had taken 6 weeks each to arrive. And by the time Margaret read them, the information inside was already ancient history. The rooming house he described, he had already left. The job he mentioned, he had already lost. The optimism in the final paragraph already quietly revised by circumstances she would not hear about for another month. She wrote back, of course. She wrote carefully on a single sheet in the small, deliberate handwriting of someone who had taught herself to read from a Bible and an almanac, and sheer stubbornness. She wrote about the children and the roof, and the neighbour's cow that had gotten into the kitchen garden again, and at the end, after all the practical things, she wrote 4 words that she then crossed out, and then wrote again because they were true, and she had decided that true things deserved to survive the crossing out. She folded the letter and walked 3 miles to the nearest post-rider's stop, and paid what she was asked without flinching, because some distances are not really about geography at all. The letter arrived in Philadelphia 11 days later. James was not at the address she had sent it to. It waited for him anyway, in a wooden box behind a counter, patient as only paper can be. They left before dawn, almost always. This was not poetry. It was practicality, the cold logic of men who had learnt that the road was kinder in the early hours, before the heat or the rain or the other travellers made everything more difficult than it needed to be. A post-rider in 1775 would rise in the dark of whatever inn or farmhouse had taken him in the night before, eat whatever was offered without complaint, check the saddlebags with the particular thoroughness of someone who understood that what was inside them mattered more than what was inside him, and then ride out into a morning that was still deciding what kind of day it wanted to be. The roads received them without ceremony. The forests closed behind them like water closing over a stone, and they were gone, carrying other people's lives in leather pouches worn soft with years of exactly this. The saddlebags were heavier than they looked, not always in weight. Sometimes a full bag of letters weighed no more than a good loaf of bread, but in the other way that things can be heavy, the way that has nothing to do with scales. Inside those bags were business contracts and unpaid debts and notices of death and announcements of birth and apologies that had taken years to write, and proposals of marriage and refusals of the same, and at least one letter on any given route on any given week that someone had been waiting for so long that the waiting had become a kind of home they were afraid to leave. The riders did not read these letters. This was partly law and partly honour and partly something more practical. Most of them moved through the world at a pace that did not leave much room for other people's grammar, but they felt the weight. Every one of them, in their own way, felt it. There was a rider named Elias who worked the route between Hartford and New Haven, a stretch of road he had covered so many times he could have walked it in his sleep, and possibly had. He was 31 years old and had been doing this since he was 19, which meant he had spent more than a decade in the particular solitude of a man on a horse between destinations, with nothing but weather and his own thinking for company. He knew every farmhouse along the route, every dog that would chase him and every dog that had given up, every creek crossing that turned treacherous in March, every hill that looked gentle from a distance and was not. He knew which families waited by the road when they were expecting something, and which ones never came out at all, and he had learned, over years of watching, count, at all, that you could tell a great deal about a life by how a person walked toward you when you were carrying their mail. Some ran. Children, mostly, but sometimes adults too. A woman in an apron still floury from the morning, a man with a tool still in his hand, forgetting entirely to be dignified because something inside them had broken open at the sight of the bag. Others walked slowly with the careful pace of people who had been disappointed before and were rationing their hope, and some, the ones that stayed with Elias longest in the quiet hours on the road, did not come out at all. In the quiet hours on the road, did not come out at all, and he would leave the letter tucked under a stone by the door and ride on, and he would never know what was inside it, or why no one came, or what the stone felt holding something that had travelled so far to arrive somewhere so still. He did not think of himself as important, he thought of himself as reliable, which in his estimation was better. The letters he carried did not know the difference, and arrived just the same. He worked at night mostly. This was an old habit, worn smooth by decades of use, the particular productivity of a mind that had learned to do its best thinking when the world had finally stopped making noise. The candle on his desk was always the same kind, thick and slow-burning, the kind that did not flicker without reason, because Franklin had long ago decided that unnecessary drama was a waste of everyone's time, including the candles. His maps were spread across the table in overlapping layers, held flat at the corners by whatever was nearest: an inkwell, a book, once a cold cup of tea he had forgotten entirely, and in the margins of these maps, in handwriting so small it required a particular angle of light to read, he made his calculations. Not the grand calculations of a man building a monument, the quiet calculations of a man fixing something broken, one small correction at a time. He was not, it should be said, starting from nothing. A postal system of sorts had existed in the colonies since 1692, assembled and reassembled by various hands with varying degrees of competence and commitment, like a fence that kept being repaired by people who had never quite agreed on what it was supposed to keep in or out. Franklin himself had served as a colonial postmaster before, appointed jointly with a man named William Hunter back in 1753. And in those years he had done something that his predecessors had never bothered to do. He had actually ridden the routes. He had gone out onto the roads himself, in the weather at the pace of the thing, and measured not just the distances but the experience of them, where the delays truly lived, where the system lost its grip on a letter and let it drift into uncertainty. He had counted and noted, and returned with the specific knowledge of someone who had not merely studied a problem but inhabited it. Now, in 1775, with everything larger and more urgent, he brought all of that back to the table. He understood that the routes needed to be not just shorter, but logical, organized around the places where people actually penetrated the towns that were growing, the crossroads that were becoming something more than crossroads. He understood that the riders needed predictable schedules because a letter that might arrive on any day between Tuesday and the following Thursday was not really a reliable letter at all. It was a rumor with postage, and he understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had once been poor and remembered it precisely, that the rates needed to make sense to ordinary people, that a system built only for merchants, and the wealthy was not a system for a nation, it was a system for a class. And he was no longer interested in building things for classes. There was a young assistant in his office named Robert, 23 years old and possessed of extremely neat handwriting and an earnest desire to be useful, who would arrive each morning to find new notes left on his desk in Franklin's small, dense script. Adjustments to routes, questions about distances, requests to verify whether a particular road through a particular county was passable in winter or merely theoretically passable, which was a different thing entirely. Robert worked through these notes with quiet diligence, sending inquiries, compiling responses, building the slow, factual foundation beneath Franklin's larger vision. He told his mother in a letter that the work was not exciting, but felt important, the way that laying a floor feels important, not dramatic, not visible, when it is done well. When it is done well, but absolutely necessary to everything that happens above it. Franklin, had he read it, would have called that exactly right and meant it as the highest possible praise. The candle burned low each night, and the maps grew more covered in small corrections, and the system that would carry a nation's voice slowly, quietly began to find its shape. It arrived on a Wednesday, which was not a day that the town of Hadley, Massachusetts had ever assigned any particular significance, and which would not, after this, ever feel entirely ordinary again. The post rider, not Elias, ever. A different man, younger, with a horse that was better than he deserved and a disposition that was worse, came through just after mid-morning, when the light was the colour of old honey and the air carried the first serious suggestion of the winter that was coming. He stopped at the ordinary, which was what taverns were called then, a word that meant ordinary but contained multitudes, and he handed over a small bundle of letters, tied with a piece of cord that been tied and untied so many times it had forgotten how to hold a knot. The ordinary's owner, a wide man named Cornelius, who had strong opinions about everything, and kept most of them to himself, sorted through the bundle with the practised disinterest of someone who had handled other people's correspondence for years, without ever quite losing the awareness that each piece of paper represented something alive. Most of the letters were business, a notice about a debt, a reply to an inquiry about lumber prices that had taken so long to arrive. The prices had changed twice since the question was asked. A brief communication between two brothers about their mother's estate that had the tight, airless quality of words written by people trying very hard not to say what they actually meant. And then, at the bottom of the bundle, a single letter addressed in handwriting that was not quite steady. The handwriting of someone old or unwell, or writing by insufficient light, or all three at once. It was addressed to a woman named Catherine Marsh, who lived on the eastern edge of town in a house set back from the road behind an apple orchard that had been her husband's particular pride before her husband became the past tense. Cornelius set it aside with the others and went back to his mourning. Catherine came for it 2 days later, walking the 1.5 miles from her house with the slightly deliberate pace of a woman who had decided to stop hurrying through things. She was 54 years old and had the face of someone who had spent a great deal of time outdoors and an equal amount of time thinking, and both had left their marks in ways that suited her. She paid the fee without looking at the letter first, which was either discipline or superstition, and walked back out into the November morning and stood for a moment in the road with it in her hands. The letter was from her son, William, who had left Hadley 4 years earlier to try his fortune in Charleston, and had, by most available evidence, been trying it without much success ever since. His letters had been infrequent and carefully optimistic, in the specific way of someone who suspects their optimism is not convincing anyone. This letter was different. This letter said he was coming home, not because things had gone well. They had not gone well, and he did not pretend otherwise, which Catherine recognized as a kind of maturity the boy she had sent away had not yet possessed. But he was coming home in the spring, and he wanted to know if the orchard still bloomed the way he remembered, and whether she still made the apple cake with the burnt sugar top, and whether she thought perhaps there might still be something in Hadley worth staying for. She read it twice, standing in the road. Then she folded it with great care and put it inside her coat, against her chest, where it rode home with her like a small warm thing that had been cold for a very long time. That evening she wrote back immediately, the longest letter she had written in years, and walked it to Cornelius before the ink was properly dry, and paid without hesitation, because some distances collapse the moment you decide to cross them. The system Franklin was building had just done something no road or rider fully understood. It had not merely moved paper through space, it had moved a family through time, closing 4 years of silence in the space of a Wednesday morning in a town that would never think of ordinary Wednesdays in quite the same way again. there is a particular kind of building that happens before anyone decides to build anything. It happens in the accumulation of small decisions, each one modest and practical and entirely unaware of its own significance. A road widened here, a schedule regularized there, a rate lowered just enough that a farmer's wife in Western Connecticut can afford to send a letter without choosing between that and something necessary. This is how nations are actually made, most of the time, not in the dramatic moments that get written into the fronts of books, but in the quiet infrastructure of ordinary life. The 10,000 unremarkable improvements that eventually add up to something that can hold people together when everything else is trying to pull them apart. By 1776, Franklin's postal routes were doing exactly this, and almost no one was paying attention, which was precisely how the most important things tend to work. The routes now ran like a loose spine down the eastern seaboard, connecting Portsmouth in the north to Savannah in the south, with branching paths that reached inland toward the places where people were beginning to gather and build and argue about what kind of life was possible in a new world. The schedules had been tightened. The riders knew their routes with the intimacy of people who had learned a road the way you learn a person, not from a description but from long acquaintance, from all the moods and seasons and small surprises that only reveal themselves over time. A letter posted in Boston could now reach Philadelphia in as little as 6 days under good conditions, which was not fast by any standard that would come later, but was, by the standards of 1776, something close to miraculous. People were beginning to expect it. They were beginning to plan around it. And expectation, Franklin understood, was the first cousin of trust. Go ahead and adjust your pillow. You will want to be comfortable for what this chapter is really about, which is something quieter and more profound than postal schedules. What the routes were building beneath the surface of their practical function was a shared sense of place. When a printer in Philadelphia could read a letter from a merchant in Boston that was less than a week old, something changed in the texture of their relationship to each other. The distance did not disappear, but it became imaginable, crossable in the mind, even before it was crossed in body. When a farmer in Virginia learned, through a posted gazette carried along Franklin's routes, about a debate happening in a meeting hall in Massachusetts, he became, in some small but real way, a participant in that debate. The colonies had always shared a continent. The postal routes were teaching them to share a conversation, and a shared conversation, given enough time, becomes something that feels like belonging. There was a printer in Baltimore named Samuel Eds, no relation to the more famous printing families, just a man with a press and strong opinions and a subscription to 2 different newspapers that arrived by post from 2 different cities, who began, that year, to notice something he could not quite articulate. He was reading news from Philadelphia and Boston and New York with a regularity and freshness that had not existed even 3 years before, and something in the cumulative effect of this one as changing how he thought. He had always known in an abstract way that there were people in those cities living lives and holding views and making decisions that affected him. Now he felt it. The abstraction had developed a pulse. He mentioned this to his wife one evening, not quite knowing how to say it, settling finally on the observation that the world felt smaller lately, which she correctly identified as not quite what he meant, but close enough to agree with. The world was not smaller. The world was exactly the same size it had always been, every mile of it unchanged. What had changed was the thread running through it, thin and persistent, and made of nothing more dramatic than paper and leather, and the willingness of tired men on horseback to show up in all weather and keep moving. A nation is not a place. It is a habit of reaching toward each other across the distance, practiced so regularly that it stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like instinct. Franklin was building the habit one route at a time. and the nation was learning it without quite knowing it was in school. The room in London was large and cold and full of people who had decided before the proceedings began what the proceedings would conclude. This is the particular cruelty of certain official gatherings. They wear the costume of inquiry while performing the theatre of verdict, and everyone present understands this except, perhaps, the person standing at the centre of it, who has made the mistake of believing that evidence and reason are the relevant currencies. It was January of 1774, more than a year before Franklin would take up his postal appointment, and he was standing in a room called the Cockpit, named for the animal fights that had once been staged there, which said something about the continuity of human entertainment across centuries, while a man named Alexander Wedderburn dismantled him in front of 35 lords and dignitaries who laughed at the appropriate moments because laughing was what was expected of them. Wedderburn was the Solicitor General of Great Britain, which meant he was very good at performing contempt with the vocabulary of law, and on this particular morning he applied that talent to Franklin with a thoroughness that went beyond professional duty into something that felt almost personal, though they barely knew each other. He accused Franklin of being a thief, a schemer, a man without honour. This in relation to some letters Franklin had obtained and shared, letters written by a colonial governor that revealed a troubling enthusiasm for suppressing American liberties. Franklin had believed, with the particular optimism of a man who still thought problems could be solved through the correct application of information, that showing these letters to the right people would clarify things. He had been wrong about what clarity could accomplish in a room that had already made up its mind. He stood through it all without speaking. This was not passivity. It was the controlled stillness of a man who understood that every visible reaction would be used against him, that the room wanted him to be diminished, and the only power left to him was the refusal to perform his own diminishment. He stood in his old velvet coat, the same coat he had worn to other meetings in better years, and he let Wedderburn's words move through the air around him without giving them a place to land. And when it was over, he walked out into the London cold and stood on the street for a moment that no one recorded, but which must have existed. A moment of absolute private reckoning. He understood something now that he had perhaps always suspected but had hoped, with the persistent hopefulness of a certain kind of intelligent man, was not quite true. The distance between the colonies and the crown was not a distance that better roads or faster letters or more efficient communication could close. It was not a postal problem. It was a political one, and political distances of a certain kind do not yield to engineering. They yield only to time and rupture and the painful, necessary work of people deciding that they are, in fact, separate, that the gap between them is not a failure of connection, but the accurate measurement of a genuine difference. He returned to Philadelphia the following year, carrying this understanding like a stone in his coat pocket, heavy and constant and oddly clarifying. When they offered him the role of Postmaster General, he accepted it with the full knowledge of what it was now for, not a bridge between the colonies and Britain, but the internal circulation of something that was preparing to stand alone. He was no longer building a communication system within an empire. He was building one for a country that did not yet officially exist, but was, in every room and road and letter-filled saddlebag, already becoming real. There is a particular irony in this that sits quietly in the chest if you let it settle. The British Crown, in that cold London room, in their contempt and their laughter and their absolute certainty of their own authority, had done something they did not intend. They had finished Franklin's political education. They had taken a man who believed in the possibility of reconciliation and shown him, with great thoroughness and considerable theatrical flair, exactly why reconciliation was no longer the point. He thanked them for nothing in the way that people thank no one for the lessons that cost the most, and he went home and got to work. The morning of April 18th, 1775 arrived the way that particular kind of morning always arrives, quietly, without announcement, wearing the plain clothes of any other day. The light came up slowly over eastern Massachusetts, the pale, uncertain light of a New England spring that has not yet fully committed to being spring, and along the post roads that Franklin's system had been quietly improving for months. The riders were doing what they always did. They were moving, they were cold. They were thinking about breakfast and the state of the road ahead, and whether the left saddlebag's buckle was going to hold for another week, or whether today was the day it finally gave up. They were thinking about everything except history, because history had not yet announced itself, and in the last hours before it does, the world maintains its habit of feeling entirely normal, with a completeness that is, in retrospect, almost unbearable. His name was Samuel Webb, and he was 23 years old. And he had been riding the route between Concord and Boston for 8 months, long enough to know it well, and not quite long enough to take it entirely for granted. He was not a dramatic young man. He had the steady, practical temperament of someone raised on a farm where the work did not pause for feelings, and he had carried this temperament onto the road with him the way you carry a tool that has proven itself useful. He rose that morning in a rooming house in Concord, ate bread and cold meat standing up because there was no table available, and he had long since stopped requiring one, checked his bags with his usual thoroughness, and went out into the April morning without any particular sense that it would be the last morning of a world he had known his whole life. He carried 17 letters. He had counted them the night before, as he always did, and written the number in his small leather notebook beside the date, because Franklin's new system required accounting, and Samuel was conscientious about requirements. 17 letters, moving through a morning that smelled of wet earth and wood smoke, and the faint ghost of last autumn's leaves still releasing something into the air. A letter from a merchant to his supplier about a shipment of wool that would never be collected. A letter from a young woman to her cousin describing a dance she had attended and a young man she had noticed at it, written in the giddy looping hand of someone not yet practiced at concealing delight. A letter from a minister to a colleague about a theological disagreement, so fine and so distant from the events about to unfold that reading it now would feel like a message from another universe entirely. Samuel rode through Lexington just for 4:07 in the morning. He noted, with the mild professional curiosity of someone whose job required him to notice things, that there seemed to be more people about than usual for the hour. Men standing in the road in the kind of loose, purposeful groups that suggested something had been decided or was about to be. He did not stop. His route did not require him to stop in Lexington, and Samuel was a man who followed his route. He rode past them with a nod that no one returned because no one was looking at him, and continued south toward Boston, and the letters in his bag continued their patient, oblivious journeys toward people who were expecting them. Behind him, within the hour, a shot was fired on Lexington Green that no one has ever been able to conclusively attribute to any particular hand, which is somehow appropriate for a moment that belonged to everyone and no one. Then another. Then the sound of the world tearing quietly along a seam that had been weakening for years. Samuel heard nothing. He was already too far down the road, moving at the steady pace his horse maintained by habit, carrying 17 letters through a morning that was finishing the last few minutes of being ordinary. The merchant's wool, the young woman's dance, the minister's theology, all of it travelling forward into a day that would make such things feel for a long time afterward like artifacts from a vanished civilization, precious and unreachable and heartbreakingly small. He delivered his letters. He made his notes. He turned his horse and began the ride back, not yet knowing that the road behind him led somewhere that no longer existed. The war came and went the way wars do, loudly and then slowly. And then all at once it was over, and the people left standing had to figure out what to do with a country that was no longer an argument and had become terrifyingly a responsibility. The post roads had survived mostly. Some had been damaged, some had been used for purposes Franklin had not designed them for: the movement of troops, the carrying of military dispatches, the urgent, breathless communication of people trying to win something rather than simply stay connected. But the bones of the system he had laid down were still there, underneath everything, the way the bones of a good building survive what happens to its walls. And when the war quieted and the new nation began the slow, unglamorous work of becoming real, the postal system was one of the first things they returned to, because someone had understood and kept understanding that you cannot have a country without a way for it to speak to itself. Franklin did not live to see everything that grew from the seeds he had pressed into the mud of those early roots. He died in 1790 at 84 in Philadelphia in the spring, which seems right for a man who spent his life arranging things so that other things could begin. He had held the position of Postmaster General only briefly, dismissed by the British in 1774, appointed by the Continental Congress in 1775, replaced within the year, as his diplomatic duties carried him elsewhere. But the shape of what he had built outlasted his tenure, the way that a road outlasts the person who first walked it. Because roads do not require their makers to keep walking them. They only require that someone does. By 1800, the United States postal system connected more than 900 post offices across the young country. By 1830, it was the largest postal system in the world, larger than Britain's, larger than France's, carrying not just letters but newspapers, which meant it was carrying opinions, arguments, news, poetry, sermon transcripts, political pamphlets, agricultural advice, and the 10,000 other varieties of human thought that a free press generates when given a reliable way to travel. Alexis de Tocqueville, the French writer who came to America in 1831 to understand what democracy actually looked like in practice, was astonished by it. He wrote that there was hardly a pioneer's hut in the wilderness that did not receive a newspaper, that the post had penetrated into the deepest solitudes of the forest. He meant it as an observation about infrastructure. He was actually describing something Franklin had understood from the beginning, which is that democracy is not a system of government. It is a habit of conversation, and conversations require voices that can reach each other across distances that would otherwise be silence. There is something that lives in the chest, quiet and warm and slightly aching, when you follow this story all the way to its end and realize it has no end. The postal system that Benjamin Franklin designed in the mud and candlelight of 1775 is still, in its essential form, operating. The routes have changed, the riders have become trucks and planes, and the particular magic of systems too complex to fully imagine. But the principle is unchanged, that a piece of paper with words on it, placed in the hands of a system that promises to carry it, will arrive. That the distance between people is a problem that can be engineered, if not erased. That a nation is held together not by its armies or its laws or even its shared history, but by the daily, unremarkable miracle of people continuing to reach toward each other and finding more often than not, but something reaches back. Samuel Webb's 17 letters were all delivered. We do not know what happened to most of them. The merchant, the minister, the young woman describing her dance, and the young man she had noticed. History did not think to record what became of ordinary correspondence on an extraordinary morning in April 1775, but they arrived, through everything that was about to happen, through the noise and the rupture and the long, painful work of becoming something new. They arrived, somewhere tonight, without thinking about it. Someone, is sending something to someone else. A message crossing a distance, riding a system so old and so woven into the fabric of daily life that it has become invisible. The way that the most essential things always do. They do not think of Franklin. They do not think of Samuel Webb or Margaret's rain-soaked house or Catherine standing in a November road with a letter pressed against her chest like a small warm thing returned from very far away. But the letter moves, as it always has, as it always will, and somewhere at the other end of the distance, someone is waiting for it without quite knowing they are waiting, the way we wait for all the things we need most, quietly and with a hope we have almost, but not quite, stopped believing in.